Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle the LVT-1 or LVT-A1, A standing for Armored, which was one of the armored support vehicles that came ashore with the US Marine Corps during the Second World War. Now these with these light anti-tank guns in the turret, the 37mm, were tragically not actually very good at what they were supposed to be doing. And it wouldn't be until later, when they popped a howitzer in the turret with an open turret to save on weight, that these would really find a sort of support role in the Marine Corps. These early runs, well, unfortunately, that 37mm pop gun didn't really have much of a high explosive round, so it wasn't terribly good at supporting the Marines once it got inland. The other problem with it too is, despite its size, it had pretty thin armor. It really was intended as a transport. So the painting that I'm going to do, obviously this is the armored version, but if you do have another kit which has the interior, then when it comes to doing the camouflage pattern, just leave that off. The interior would be the same grey as the rest of the hull. Anyhow, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Now, as you might be able to tell, this is actually a 3D print. This has come off of my Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, and total time it took was about 15 hours. It is colossal, certainly larger than a Sherman, but the detail on this kit is pretty good. You know, no matter where it is you get this from, whether you are using a plastic kit or a 3D print like this, you know, the painting is going to be largely the same. The only real downside with this one is that the machine guns are a little lacking in detail at this scale, but I'm not too fussed about that. Now for the painting, I'm going to pop the turrets off because that's going to make this a heck of a lot easier. Let's just put those aside for a second. Now you'll probably notice that I don't ordinarily wear a glove while I'm painting, but because this has so many large flat surfaces, you know, I thought it would be more useful to make sure I'm not going to get fingerprints all over everything. Entirely optional though, it's up to you. But speaking of making a mess, we're actually going to start with the tracks, because if we make a mess with these, we're going to paint this camo pattern later, which will make it much easier to clean up. Now I'm using Lead Belcher from Citadel, but any sort of mid-tone gunmetal color will be fine. Take your time when you come near any areas that you don't want to be silver. It's going to be unavoidable that you do make, you know, a few little mistakes as you go, but we're not too fussed about that. Now once you've done the tracks, I do suggest as well doing the machine guns and the coaxial on the turret in this same color. It's really up to you though. Now from here you could honestly just shade the whole thing, because the vast majority of these amphibious tanks were in this straight grey color scheme. But there were quite a few that had this camo pattern. Now this is largely random, so I've got here some dark sand, and I'm going to start just making a bit of a mess. You'll notice this doesn't cover terribly well when we start, but what we're going to need to do is to come back and give this a second coat. At the moment, I'm more interested in just blocking out some of the camo pattern. Now I am following along. I've got the Flames of War hobby page open because they've got quite a few good examples of camo patterns, but these were fairly random, to be honest. So what I'm going to do is first of all sketch out and just get the lines down. You'll see this is quite a messy process, and I was using really the wrong brush. I've switched to my monster brush here from the Army Painter, but any sort of large, softest brush is going to do the job. Once you've got an idea of where you want these patterns to be laid down, you can start solidifying them. And this, unfortunately, this is the slow part. So take your time, fill in sort of one area at a time, and then we'll come back and have a look at what this looks like after a second coat across all of the blotches that I want to make. Now I'm about halfway through, and you can see that this is quite a messy job. I've even swapped back on up to my bigger brush for this because I was getting bored of doing it the nice looking way. I've popped the turret back on quickly just so I can jam, that's close enough. We'll jam the camo pattern across the turret so that it fits what the hull itself is doing. You do not need to do this, but it does look kind of cool if the pattern follows that properly. Now, I would love to tell you that painting is always fun and great and never makes you want to stick your paintbrush in your ear and dig your brain out. But unfortunately, this takes a little longer than I would like. Sometimes you're just going to have to put that work in. And 3 coats of this junk later, you'll see there's still some grey showing through in some areas. And we do have a little bit of ghosting along the edges of those camo patterns. So I'm going to go back and we're going to do part of our cleanup stage now. So I've gone back to uniform grey, which was our primer colour. And I'm going to use this just to tidy up and straighten some of the edges of the camo pattern so that we get a nice sharp edge to things. Now it is up to you how much of this you want to do. You might like the slightly worn look that, that little bit of ghosting gives. Myself, I am going to spend the time here. Well, that's quite bright. I am going to sharpen up all of these edges because I think that's going to look better once we're done. So yeah, goodness, here we go. Now you'll see how tightening that up does make that look much more crisp, but I really like that finish. What I'm going to do now, we'll go back to our gunmetal color and any little bits that we need to touch up on the tracks or the MGs if you have painted those. Just tidy those up now. Now for this next part, you'll see the glove is back on. I'm using my 1:1 strong tone and quick shade mixing medium mix. Though you could just use straight strong tone if you wanted. I do suggest thinning it out is going to give you a slightly better result here. I'm going to load up a big old brush and start applying this all over the model. Now I'm going to quickly load up these big flat panels and I'll show you something cool. So after a few seconds, you're going to get these really obvious tide marks. Now just dab off some of this from your brush. You don't want to rinse it out entirely. And then let's just make some quick sweeping motions down and sort of scrub off the excess of our shade. If you keep your brush moving in the same direction, you're going to get a neat sort of rainwater effect. And as easy as that, you don't have to worry about pooling on flat areas. So now comes the fun part. I'm going to go around and do this to the whole vehicle. I would recommend that you do one side at a time. So completely finish one side, let it dry thoroughly, and then do the other, and so on. So this can take a little while, but it will be worth it when it's finished. Now after plenty of time to dry, this is what you'll have. And that's not looking too bad. You'll see we've dealt with most of the tide marks. There are still 1 or 2 little issues, like along the back here, but I'm not too worried about that, because we're going to tidy that up as we go. One thing I am going to do, though, is some of these areas, like at the front here, they are missing a little bit of definition. So I've got here some pure strong tone. So I'm just going to paint a little bit of strong tone straight into this gap here, just to accentuate what might have been missed. Now anywhere else that I want to do that, so this hatch here, for example, along the top here, just a little bit of neat strong tone, and that will help define some of these areas a little more. Now you could do the whole tank in this way if you don't want to, you don't want to wash the whole thing. It is a little more time consuming, but it is much tidier. So it's up to you. If you think this sort of slow but very tidy method is more your style, then go for it. Now whether you decide to do that additional little bit of paint or not, that's up to you. But next anyway, we're going to go on to some dry brushing. And I'm going to go back to my dark sand, and I am going to work most of this off of my brush into a bit of kitchen towel. I'm using one of my little makeup brushes here, because this lets us be quite precise, but still very soft. So what I'm going to do is lightly pass over the areas of the beige sort of stripes. You'll see it first. There we go. This might take a little bit of time to get the most out of it, but just flick over some of those flat areas, build up that color, and reintroduce a little bit of depth to all of these camo patterned areas. I've got too much on my brush there. So take your time and let's fill all of these areas in. Now when you come to these flat panels, It'll sort of stipple in a slightly circular motion, and you'll be able to build that color up, or getting a little bit of texture to what you're doing. So let's cover over like that, and it's a little subtle on camera, unfortunately, but it will look cool in person, so keep the faith there, give that a shot. Then we're going to move on and do exactly the same thing with our uniform grey, just to brighten up some of the flatter areas of colour, get rid of some of the tide marks if there are any of those remaining. And if you have any areas where you've gone a little overboard with your stone colour, well, let's just flick in there and tidy those up too. Now for our final dry brush, I've got here a little bit of pale sand, and this is almost an ivory colour. It's important that you're working most of this off. You really only want a tiny whisper of this on your brush. So once you've finished rubbing it out, what I'd suggest is flick your tank upside down. Don't look too hard at the underside there, guys. But flick along the edges of the underside to get an idea of what you're going to leave behind. Now, pale sand's quite good because having very little colour of its own, when we dry brush both the grey and the beige, we're going to get this dry brush colour that works for both of those areas. You probably want to go a little bit heavier on the areas where the beige is, but what I'm going to do now is very lightly just flick along the edges of all the areas of detail, just to give those a nice sharp edge to them. Now at this stage, if you're going to apply any decals, now's the time to apply them before you do your weathering. Now some of the reading that I did suggests that the Marines stopped putting a lot of tactical markings on their vehicles, kind of figuring that they were aiming points for Japanese anti-tank guns. Whether or not this turns out to be accurate, I'm not 100% certain, but it is an extremely handy excuse not to have to apply decals. What I'm going to do though is move straight on to the weathering. So I'm going to take off these turrets again. And I've got here a little Vallejo red leather, which I have added a whole lot of water to. It's very similar more to a wash, and I'm going to apply this into just a few recesses to give us a kind of rusted action look. I might have a little bit too much paint in there actually, so any areas where you reckon it's going to look good, a bit careworn and with some rustiness around it, you can just paint in thin lines of this. And the beautiful thing with this too is if ever you apply too much, you can just get in there with your finger and quite roughly scrub it out. And that will kind of work it into the paint job. It does make it look a little more realistic. So particularly along the front here, let's add just a little bit of this around the hatches. But yeah, anywhere you think this is going to look cool, knock yourself out. A little bit of red leather and some water. Now it is possible to go overboard with this fairly quickly, but I think it looks pretty cool. Now what I've got is some brown sand mixed in with a ton of water. We want this to be almost translucent. So once again, just pulling off these turrets. And we're going to use this to simulate sort of dust and sand that's caught up on the vehicle. So you can be quite generous with this. You really want to jam it around the bottom. And anywhere that it's sort of collecting a bit more than you'd like, you can just scrub it away with your finger. And when this dries, it's going to look proper grimy and more subtle than it looks going on, let's say. So make sure that you're not missing anywhere. And really pay attention to the running gear and the lower areas of the vehicle. And then once that's dried, you can either give it another pass or decide that's enough. Now once that's dried, you'll get a really cool chalky sort of dust effect over all of the vehicle, which I like to sort of concentrate on the front, where I imagine it sort of dipped under the water, picked up some beach sand as it's going. It's so easy to do, to get that really cool, sandy, dusty effect. Anyhow, what I'm going to do now is take this bad boy outside, hit it with a matte varnish just to protect all of that work, and then we'll get a look at what it looks like all finished. And then at last, our LVT is complete. Now, I actually really came to enjoy doing this. There is a lot of work involved, and unfortunately not enough sunlight for the spinny thing to really behave, so let's just give it a push. So no matter which variant of LVT you're painting, this was a fairly common colour scheme. Particularly later on, if you were doing something with the M8 Scott style howitzer turret, then painting it essentially the same as a Sherman would actually be more accurate. But for the early deployment of the LVTs, and particularly the armoured variant like this looks pretty close to everything I've been able to find. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paint and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable, folks. Really helps me do stuff like this. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. And I do love if you post something on Instagram, make sure to tag me either in the description or in the comments so that I get to see it, because I get a kick out of seeing everybody's work. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.